Together with my colleague, Dr. Alison Eldridge, chairing this panel. So before we get going, just a brief word of context. This session was originally planned to mark the publication of the latest in the long series of Sociological Review monographs, this volume titled Revisiting Culture and Society Towards a Politics of Social Transformation. And this volume, which Alison and I have had the great privilege of editing together, well, it's not really a monograph. It's comprised of a series of new research articles which are brought together as a way of honouring and owning and acknowledging and engaging the deep and sustained contribution to the traditions of critical sociology made by our dear colleague, Professor Bridget Fowler. Alison's going to say a few words about Bridget in a moment, so I'm not going to steal her thunder. But I might just briefly explain that when we were initially planning this Festschrift, because that's what it is, a Festschrift, we had in mind some of the kind of characteristic aspects of the work that Bridget has pursued over many years. One, her deep curiosity about cultural practices and the way in which those are both entangled with but can also become the sites for resistance to different forms of oppression. Two, her always scrupulously historicized concern with social change, with how social change can and has happened, which is, of course, itself a reflection of the fact that Bridget has a lifelong commitment to feminist and social struggles aimed at envisioning and trying to enact exactly that kind of change. And thirdly, her unstinting immersion in the efforts to conceptualize, theorize, name, describe and understand social life. So the essays that are collected in this volume echo those kind of broad concerns, but in relation to a series of kind of concrete empirical and historical examples, which includes the studies of the fields of wine, ballet, poetry, photography, art criticism, practices of translation, the education of economic students, struggles around reproductive rights in the French colonies, the Marxist humanism of Raya Deniuskeva, and the nurturing of hope in the neoliberal university. So I said it was planned as a launch. As it happens, and this is absolutely no responsibility of the Sociological Review, but rather of Sage publishers who haven't quite managed to get their house in order on this. It's not actually available right now, but if you think that brief outline sounds appetizing, there is a possibility of pre-ordering a copy of the monograph there. Thanks to Danielle for providing that. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with the wonderful contributors to this volume and also with the superbly helpful staff and colleagues at the Sociological Review, who I just want to really acknowledge. They've been absolutely exemplary. And a particular word in her absence for Karen Throsby, who was the monograph series editor that we worked with most closely and was just a very gracious, constantly patient source of support for us. I guess what we hope that this volume does is that it honours, it recognises the debt that many of us feel to Bridget and the work that she's done, but it does that not just by saying thank you, as it were, but by trying to contribute to and trying to nourish the project of a critical sociological imagination of which she has been and continues to be such an exemplar. So the collection opens with a long conversation between Bridget and another dear colleague, Les Back, And what we thought, rather than proposing a kind of conventional panel of papers for this penultimate session, was that it would be more interesting to revisit that conversation and perhaps to try to use the time that we've got to explore some of the kinds of questions that are central to the conversations that have been being had more broadly in this conference that we've all been enjoying over the last few days. So particularly questions about what it means to do sociology today, not just as an intellectual endeavour, but as a kind of practice. What is involved in the craft of sociology today? And questions also, because this has been such a pivotal part of things that Bridget's been concerned with, about what sociologists might learn from other forms of aesthetic and creative ways of engaging with and articulating our experiences in the world. So in a moment, Alison's going to say a few words about Bridget. After that, we've got the chance to watch a short film made by Bridget's son, Luke Fowler, who is a very accomplished visual artist. It's called Mum's Cards, and it offers its own lovely testament to the scholarship and the curiosity that has so characterised Bridget's work. And then we'll hand over to Les and Bridget, who are going to talk for 40 minutes, thereabouts, and hopefully that leaves us 20 minutes, something like that, for some questions and some wider discussion at the end. So thank you, everybody, and with that, I'll hand over to Alison.
Thanks, Andy. Well, before, as Andy said, we hand over to Bridget and Les, I just really wanted to sketch out what I think are two portraits of Bridget. In her essay, Those that Really Know Teach, written for her mother, Maya Angelou pointed out that a true teacher must have a calling, but one that is guarded by a bounty of courage. Angelou says, the calling informs the teacher that her knowledge is needed in new, uncharted areas, and the courage makes the teacher dare the journey. As with Angelou's mother, Bridget has both calling and courage, and her practice of doing sociology today is one that's underpinned by 5 decades of teaching, research, and scholarship. And while she's perhaps most well known for writing on Pierre Bourdieu, Bridget's sociological imagination has been nurtured by a critical engagement with a range of thinkers. Each encounter is carefully documented, either as tiny penciled notes in the margins of a book or in one of the many thousands of index cards that are filed, boxed, and stacked, surrounding her with ongoing and changing conversations as she goes about her work. Bridget has never been afraid to read both with and against different writers, often combining them in very innovative ways. So in this sense, C. Wright Mill's essay on intellectual craftsmanship might be read almost in its entirety as what I think of a portrait of Bridget. So Mills put it that, in many ways, cross-classification is the very grammar of the sociological imagination. Like all grammar, it must be controlled and not allowed to run away from its purposes. So it might seem a bit odd to draw attention to this point of control at a conference with Undisciplining as its title, but it seems to us to be an important point, and particularly in relation to thinking about that practice and discipline of doing sociology. And we can remember that Mills was certainly not one for following rules. Against those who mechanistically reproduced only the theories and methods of what he called their training, he took delight in ideas of chance, luck, and play as essential towards inviting and cultivating a sociological imagination. So this wasn't an invitation for sloppy workmanship. Instead, it meant paying rigorous attention to the ways in which different social phenomena might be connected and better understood. It meant paying attention to one's files, having the courage to rearrange them and to avoid the dangers inherent when thinking becomes dominated by any master category. It meant being receptive to unforeseen and unplanned linkages. But most importantly of all, it meant bringing together what you're doing intellectually and what you are experiencing as a person. Here, said Mills, you will not be afraid to use your experience and relate it directly to the various work in progress. As such, the art of note-taking was imperative to Mills, whether snatches of conversation heard on the street or even dreams. Note-taking was a route that would lead to more systematic thinking and would lend increased intellectual relevance to direct experience. Now, as Andy said, we're going to see in a moment exactly what Bridget's note-taking looks like. And we're so grateful to Luke Fowler and to the Modern Institute in Glasgow for the opportunity to present the short film that Luke made about this, aptly titled Mum's Cards. As Andy said, Luke is of course Bridget's son, but he's also an established artist with international recognition. And his photographs also document the interview between Bridget and Les in the special issue. So the film we're about to see gives us that second portrait of Bridget, one that really brings her practice to life in a tangible way. So through it, we're offered a very direct visual encounter with the sociological imagination at work, one that is creative and reflexive, but also careful and above all disciplined in its order and precision. But just as Mills wrote his version of intellectual craftsmanship as a manifesto for the would-be sociologist as much as to empower those outside the discipline, Bridget's version of doing sociology is also one that endeavours to reach out beyond the academic confines of a subject area. As such, she shares with Mills the important idea of undisciplining, which frames this conference. Bourdieu describes this very well, and I found this cited in Fowler actually. As sociology gives the knowledge of determinisms and thus a possibility of liberty in relation to determinisms, to write sociologically or to tell everybody about it is to work to diffuse, to universalize the possibility of a liberty. Now, both Andy and I were very fortunate at different times to have had Bridget as a teacher. In a memorable first lecture on the sociology of art and literature, Bridget declared, "I have no wish to seduce you all into the arms of Bourdieu." But seduce us she did, not just into the arms of Bourdieu necessarily, but certainly into the idea of sociology as a socially purposeful education with precisely that pursuit of the diffusion of liberty at its heart. So we'll hand over to the film now, and then you'll hear more from Bridget and Les.
Tell me how you became a sociologist.
Well, I think the roots of anyone's turn to sociology are always very individual. In my case, I think there was the fact that my family had been downwardly socially mobile due to two things: my grandfather's loss of his business during the Great Depression of 1929-30, and followed in very quick succession, my father had a terrible accident, which meant that his body was profoundly weakened, and he was in pain constantly for the rest of his life. As a result, he and my mother were always very economically insecure. So I've adopted a little system where if I'm precisely quoting, then of course I use the words verbatim of the author. Then I try to summarize in my own words, but then in square brackets I put any critical comments or references to interconnections with other ideas after that, so I'll remind myself later on what my response to that book was. there were a number of people in the social science departments at Leeds who had a profound impact on me. The social sciences were a haven for exiles at that time. So there was Herminio Martins, who was an exile from the right-wing Salazar regime in Portugal. There was John Rex, who was an exile from the apartheid regime in South Africa. There was Justin Grossman in politics, who lectured to us, who was an exile from McCarthyism. There was the professor, Eugene Grebenik, whose family had been exiles from Russian pogroms. So not all the members of sociology, for example, were exiles, but the result of their combined impact on a young student was to displace your cozy predisposition that the capitalist world system was one that was well ordered and benign. I've always used library books a lot and taken notes initially on paper on those library books, whether it was the Leeds reference library in the middle of the town or sociology section at Leeds or the Brotherton. Those cards that you see on my desk at the moment, either in filing cabinets or in shoeboxes, are more permanent than paper. I suppose you could say they were a product of necessity, because in my early years as a lecturer, and really right the way through until perhaps the last 10 years, I couldn't afford many books. I've always been concerned particularly about the cultural sphere, and I see it as being split between certain forms of popular culture, like these women's magazine stories that I analysed that were circulating amongst only working class readers. And I see various forms of popular culture as having sort of mythical elements in which they reinforce the taken for granted ideas of what a social order is. Other elements of the cultural sphere I see, like Adorno, as offering a critical understanding of social relations, of whether it's photography or Thomas Mann or the futurists in Russia prior to the Russian Revolution. So I see, I don't want to separate off culture from society. I think we have to think of the whole lot together. It's a product of a false specialization to split them off. I've always found theoretical position taking immensely difficult, but very important. These wars of ideas don't just preoccupy you when you're a student. If you have a temperament with an open mind, they go on disturbing you all your life.
No? Yes, it is. Fantastic. So I think Bridget is going to stand at the podium, and I'm going to just sit and ask you some questions, just to say a little bit while Bridget organises her paper. This whole project has had an extraordinary journey. So initially, the event, if I'm right, Andy and Alison, was going to be in Glasgow as a live event. And then the pandemic intervened and many other delays. And so the contribution that Andy kindly talked about was recorded in that room, surrounded by all of your cards during the pandemic. And then I came and we worked on the transcript of those four sessions, 4 recording sessions, weren't they? Yeah. And we compiled it. Ideas that disturb you all of your life. I know there's something so powerful in that, Bridget. And I wanted, what we've done is to kind of agree some questions to explore together in 5 broad themes. And the first one is on craft. And then we're going to move to talk about books and literature, photography, disciplines and undisciplining, and then finally sociological personality. So, Bridget, I think what the film captures so much is your craft, what you do, and in terms of reading and note-taking. And I just wanted to start to ask you a little bit about the tools of your craft and how you think about them. I guess in a way, what the film gives us is this portrait of probably something which is a kind of habitual practice that you've developed over a long time.
Well, before I answer, can I just thank Andy and Alison very much for the extraordinary generosity, which I feel is unmerited, of their tributes. Intellectual craftsmanship, an idea, of course, that both C. Wright Mills, about whom Alison spoke so eloquently, and Bourdieu were at one. I think it's extremely important, and it's also unpretentious, which I think is good. On my own tools, let me say that I'm no good at skim reading. I've never been able to do it properly. So when I read, I usually like to read twice. I mark the first time, and then the second time I take notes. And that way I can familiarize myself thoroughly, interrogate each idea as it comes up, and write down my response to these interrogations. I also want to emphasize, Andy used the word historicizing. I do think that to understand the present, we have to understand the past. So I think that every sociologist needs to some extent to be a historical sociologist. And that is essential if we're going to be good scholars. And I know that's a rather stuffy word. I then take my distance from certain authors. For example, there are many who claim that Pierre Bourdieu is very good on social reproduction, but they say that that's all he can write about. I disagree, and perhaps the article which I've been most pleased with on Bourdieu and social transformation in Theory and Society tries to substantiate why I think he has a theory of social change as well. All the time I'm trying to forge my own theoretical analysis, but I have had to give evidence for my ideas, of course, and I have done various pieces of rather dissimilar empirical inquiry. For example, I've used qualitative interviews in my work on women's reading and what literature they chose to read and how that related to class. I've used qualitative focus groups in my work on reading. I've used ethnographic interviews on my work on obituary as collective memory with obituary editors. I've used content analysis and used quantitative studies using SPSS to dissect the content analysis. Take, for example, the question, whom do we choose to remember? In my obituary content analysis, I found that by using a sample of 883 obituaries from different newspapers and at different periods of time, I was able to throw cold water onto one of the most common assertions of the obituary editors. They claimed that the obituary had been thoroughly democratized. Anyone who had had any kind of a significant life, had done anything worthwhile, would get an obituary. In fact, what my research showed was that the obituary is to quite a large extent about the social reproduction of the dominant class. For example, 72% of my obituary subjects overall were people who had been to public schools. 72%. And if you look at the time at which they were born, then only 5% of the population had, in fact, been to public schools. So it's very disproportionate. As many as 35% had been to Oxford and Cambridge. Whereas again, if you look at their cohort, only 6% of, say, the 1920s born people had been to any kind of university, let alone Oxford or Cambridge. So an extraordinary discrepancy. Or if you looked at the question of gender, if you look then in the period which I was then researching before my book, 2000 to 2001, the most recent time, only 20% of the obituaries were of women. And that was in The Independent, which was the most progressive on that area. Only 5% of the obituary subjects were black or brown. And bear in mind that obituaries even in British newspapers, might be for people who had died in the whole world. But I might also add that when I came to looking at the obituaries, the knowledge I'd acquired about cultural genres was quite useful. So it's very far from the case that all obituaries are appreciative, approbatory. That's the received wisdom, that they are positive in this way, but actually it's not true. Some could be highly critical, particularly of, I have to say, foreign politicians, not very often British, especially corrupt African politicians. Some also could be tragic figures, the footballer who let in as a goalkeeper the ultimate goal that lost his Brazilian team the World Cup, and so on. Others could be highly ironic. For example, the obituary for the romantic fiction writer Barbara Cartland, and you could see obituary writers were going to town, enjoying writing about her. So what I found that I was having to do, because it was a very new subject for a sociologist, was to construct the subject, to develop a set of theoretical concepts, and then to conquer with it. Well, excuse the rather militaristic terms, but I think this is the procedure you should adopt. So I'm trying to use what Bourdieu calls the art of invention to approach the obituary, and not just the art of validation. So that's maybe a start.
Yeah, no, it's more than a start. I mean, the thing, you're looking at the film, but also just thinking about how the tools of our trade have changed as well. You know, in a sense, your table and your study is full of things.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think share that sort of material practice of things, books, actual objects. Whereas, you know, in our time, often people don't have any things in their offices, if they have offices at all in some institutions. And so it's not for you to answer that question, but I think it's something which I'm sure people in the room will think, wow, you know, when you think about your own practice and craft, what kind of things do I have? Do I have any things? Do I just have my laptop? You know.
Yeah.
So I think that's changing in a way. I think the film is so resonant of the unspoken in a way. And the second question was about that.
Well, I wasn't aware of that.
No, of course, it's habitual, isn't it? But I think a lot of what we do isn't spoken of, you know. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was how you get started with a difficult idea, and if you have examples of that, particularly theoretical ones. So when you're reading and sort of thinking there's something in this, I wonder if you can think of particular examples where you've had to approach an idea and then live with it.
Well, yes, of course, there are some concepts that you initially find very difficult. One of those, going back to Max Weber, was the idea of charisma of office. And I could see it with the Pope, for example, or the King. But I found it quite difficult to understand what the charisma of office was, as opposed to a charismatic leader. And then I had a little experience, which showed me what it was. And it was this. I had 3 miscarriages, which meant that I ended up having 4 children. The 3rd child was twins. Luke was one of them. So that was a bit unexpected. But I still had a full-time job. So when I came up to work, I was behind my office door marked Bridget Fowler, lecturer, Department of Sociology, Glasgow University. But when I went home, and I used to take these children out, we couldn't afford new things, and so they used to bundle into 10th or 11th or 12th hand things. And in particular, I discovered that the three youngest ones, I couldn't get them into a twin pram. So they had to go into a kind of carry-cot on wheels, which even I could see wasn't very elegant. Then one day I was in Kelvin Grove Park, and this very shabbily dressed working class man, Glaswegian, came up to me and he said, "Don't you know about family planning, hen?" He maybe had a point, but he didn't know the history. So this was an insight into how I appeared in public, together perhaps with the low value of women with children. But the discrepancy of my work existence and my home existence was very marked. So I became very aware of the magical dignity of my office. Behind that office door was someone whom students and cleaners looked up to. But outside, there was someone who could be dismissed and rather looked down on. So that was the charisma of office for me. But yeah, you talked about theoretical concepts, which are difficult. I found the idea that Weber also has of rationalization very difficult. Rationalization over Western history. And I don't, in fact, use that idea. I don't mind talking about greater systematization or greater elaboration or greater codification, but the notion that we live now in a world that's substantially more rationalized, I find difficult to take. So I am critical about some elements of the Founding Fathers. Another concept which I now increasingly find very difficult to work with is Norbert Elias's notion of civilization, which originally he tried to approach very neutrally, and he didn't want to make zero-sum comparisons between simple societies that were uncivilized and we ourselves that were civilized. He explicitly ruled that out. And he was highly aware, because he was a Freudian scholar, of the repressions, etc., associated with inhibition of the impulses. Nevertheless, he used civilization as a concept. I find that concept now, knowing more as I do about the British Empire, let alone other empires, I find it very problematic, given that what we have discovered about the barbarism with which the British took the Peking Summer Palace and destroyed it in China, or Benin and destroyed the whole Benin city. Given what we know now about habeas corpus being suspended for native subjects, given what we know now about the 3 million who died in the Bengal famine in 1943, when aid could have been got to them, I find it very difficult to talk about civilization.
Yes. Well, you know, one of the joys of doing this project with you, Bridget, has been to get to know and to correspond with your sons a little bit. And Luke was obviously with us around those. And sadly, their portrait of you hasn't been properly included, actually, in the final written version. But there was one point when we had a break and Bridget went to make some tea, and we were sitting there, and Luke turned to me and she said, you know, it's not easy being the son of a sociologist.
No, I'm sure it is.
And I looked at him and said, yeah, I know, I think my son would say exactly the same. But what I think, you know, he also said, he told lots of wonderful stories about what it was like to live in that house with you and your husband, your late husband. You know, I think there was deep appreciation in the work that was involved and how often it had to be done, you know, when other pursuits might have been opportunities. You're watching the TV, going out to movies and stuff. I want to ask a couple of questions about books and literature, because on the one hand, your cards are what you learn from the books very often that you borrow from the library.
Yeah.
But lots of sociologists have been inspired by literature, like Bourdieu, for example, Flaubert, Proust and Joyce, Howard Becker, his love of Austen and Perrick, and Mills himself, who was a fan of Balzac. Are there novelists that you find inspiring in terms of your sociology in a similar way?
That's a very good question. I don't write novels myself, particularly because I don't think I have a very good ear for retaining dialogue. But I do, as you say, like reading writers who are not just airport novelists. And Pierre Bourdieu put it very well about Flaubert, whom you referred to then. He said, he has an art of social flying. I mean, he could fly over different social circles and observe them intensely and then write about them. And I think the writers I most admire have that art of social flying. Wow. So just give you two examples. I've always liked George Eliot, the female novelist's Middlemarch, because I think it gives us such insight into the transition from feudalism to capitalism in England specifically, into, if you like, the deficits of scholarship, of dried up, obsessive scholarship, and the main character's husband, Casaubon, into the emergence of intellectual aspirations and intellectual desires in the main character. George Eliot, incidentally, was in touch with positivists in Europe, and she translated Feuerbach. I think she's a really good novelist for sociologists to read. The other person whom I thought we might think about in this context, entirely different, were Vasily Grossman and his novel Life and Fate. It has an even wider scope than Middlemarch has, and like a Tolstoyan novel, it's a picture of a social totality. But in particular, it's exceptionally interesting for the Stalin Party elite's view of Jewish physicists in the interwar period and the post-war period, for our understanding of how the Gulag operated and how liquidations were accomplished. It's also, on the other side, very graphic about Nazi concentration camps, in one of which his mother died. And what it also tells you beyond those things is how powerful is insecurity in a society, fear, pervasive fear, and how it makes conformists out of so many people. So I would urge those of you who haven't read it to try Grossman.
Well, I noticed you'd attended Ash Watson's workshop, so maybe there is some fiction from Bridget on its way. Possibly?
Perhaps.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to ask you about books that had been forgotten unfairly, but perhaps it would be better to ask you the ones that, given what you just said, are the ones we shouldn't pay so much attention to, or to try to forget. So, do you think there are books within our sort of, our republic of books that should be paid less attention to?
Well, I can remember when I was an undergraduate, I spent one summer holidays reading 100 pages a day of Talcott Parsons' The Social System. I wouldn't advise you to do that. I don't think that was the most fruitful use of my time. It was overwhelmingly concerned with social integration and with system integration, and it paid very little attention to material urgencies and the vulnerability of particular classes, working class people, poor peasants, poor farmers, to those material urgencies. So, like its title, it's a systematized book, but it can be done without. I was absolutely amazed to discover that Talcott Parsons, between 1952 and 1957, was investigated by Hoover's FBI in America with the allegation that he was a member of the American Communist Party, which I think is an extraordinarily ill-judged allegation.
Okay, Bridget, so if you were going to give gift of, you're a very, I think it comes through in the way people talk about you, your generosity of attention, but just in broad terms. If you were going to gift someone in this room a book, a sociological book, let's say, just to narrow it down for you, what would it be?
Yeah. Well, that's quite difficult because I am spoilt for so much choice. And my response is going to be a bit predictable. It would be Pierre Bourdieu's Pascalian Meditations, his last great theoretical work, not very long. I have to say that it's not the easiest of books to read, that you have to stick at it, but I do think that it's very rich. I think in particular that he explains in admirable terms what he means by the habitus and what he means especially by the torn habitus, for example, of people who've been socially mobile, or maybe downwardly socially mobile as well as upwardly. People haven't said this, but it's particularly unusual because it tries to bring together both sociology and philosophy, contemporary philosophy. So he's got things to say about Rawls and Wittgenstein and so on as well. I think he thinks they should be one subject. In fact, philosophers should all be sociologists. He stresses, it's a kind of Pascalian Marxism that he produces, and he stresses the way in which what we do is embodied and is molded by custom and habit. But nevertheless, there is room for resistance. At the end, I find it quite touching because he uses James Baldwin, the black American novelist and memoirist, and he talks about the difficulties for black parents for socializing children to be good when they know that their children may at any moment on the streets or in their schools be threatened by arbitrary authority from the police on. And he writes quite powerfully about that dilemma. And he ends the book, this is in chapter 6, with writing about being black in America as having negative symbolic capital, which I think anticipates in many ways some of the ideas of Black Lives Matter, but it was before Black Lives Matter came into being. Yeah, Pascalian meditation.
Perfect. And you know, your son's a visual artist. You've been writing about photography recently too, and I just wanted to ask you about what you find interesting in photography itself, and what's interesting about it sociologically, and what drew you to that?
Well, again, I've always been interested in photography, but I particularly was fascinated by Bourdieu's book called Photography and Middlebrow Art. And he said it was always doomed to remain a minor art. And I actually don't think he's right about that. It's where I'm at my most critical of him. And I think of photographers like, for example, Alexander Rodchenko, or Gustav Klutzis in the Russian Revolution, who introduced photography into the art schools, turned the art schools upside down. They wanted to photograph everyday life and ordinary people, but what they did was to photograph from strange angles, so that often you got an entirely new perspective. So those photographers were defamiliarizing the world. Someone mentioned earlier in this conference the Russian formalists and their idea of defamiliarization. They were doing the same. And I found that particularly fascinating. And in fact, photography then was taken up as something that workers could do, not just in Russia, the whole landmass of Russia, but in Germany, in America, etc. The other people that I found particularly fascinating, and I think photography now is not just a minor art, partly because of abstract expressionism and the fact that painters, as an act of resistance, were refusing to paint the social world. So that people were hungry for images of society, and they went to photography to get it instead of to painting as they had before. And one group that Alison's worked on, and I've worked on too, was the Farm Security Administration. Photographers employed by the American government, like Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange, and there's a black photographer called Gordon Parks, who people don't talk about in that context, which is very interesting. He's been left out of history. But the other two did take very memorable photographs of people who in the Midwest had been subject to the first climate crisis, when their land had been turned into a dust bowl with soil erosion, and the banks had foreclosed on their properties, and they'd been turned out of their farms. And these photographers went and portrayed them in their lorries on their exit from the Midwest, and in some of their very small houses where they were existing in a very miserable way. And they're very vivid portrayals.
Oh, beautiful. Well, just a couple more questions before we'll be able to invite. It's wonderful to listen to you, as always. But I thought it might be fun for us to also address the theme of the conference itself. So it's a question about disciplines and undisciplining, and I wondered what you think about the idea of undisciplining sociology.
I'm actually rather in two minds about that, probably rather reluctant to undiscipline it, if the truth be known, despite the conference. I, of course, realise that writers, historians, and artists also explore the social world. That's crucially important to remember. But I think sociologists are the only ones who have to present to us social trends and to explain those social trends. And that, I think, is particularly valuable. So I think that I would want to keep that discipline. I do notice that in some areas, for example, one I'm concerned with is Marxism, and people early on start off enthusiastically leaving their disciplines and becoming historical materialists, Marxists. But then quite often you notice the disciplinary divisions reassert themselves, so that the economist Marxists are quite different from the sociologist Marxists. And the latter place much more emphasis on culture, ideology, ideas, and not just economics. So I think that's very telling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So do you think there should be things that we should be more disciplined about in terms of our practice?
Well, I think that while we should be aware that the founding fathers, and they're mostly fathers, are of their time, and also I agree with Bamburgh and Homewood that people like Du Bois ought to be there as well, who are not there. I do think that we need to constantly take up the concepts that these founding fathers have given us and rework them in our contemporary context. So that is, I think, very much part of what is distinctive to our discipline. I mean, just a little thing that occurred to me the other day. Piketty, the economist, has spoken a lot about increasing inequalities and the declining share of the cake that's given to the lowest 50% of the population. Used to be in the period before 1970, it was from 20 to 27%, and then it's gone down now from 1979 to between 12 and 20%. And he says one of the things, of course, is the increased massive salaries of top executives. I mean, one of them last week, AstraZeneca, earned 16.5 million a year. And he said we need to look at the regulation committees, the remuneration regulation committees that determine these salaries, and they're not related to performance. And immediately I thought, well, Durkheim needs to come in here and explain the sorts of norms, the sorts of rules about how people like us ought to be paid, and how they can separate themselves from the rest of the society in thinking of who people like us are. And I think there's a space there for someone who's deeply imbued with Durkheimian ideas to look at that interface of the social and the economic.
Just one final question, Bridget, before we open out, and I'll hand back to Andy. And you know, I often think of you as a kind of sort of smiling, humane, sometimes a little bit naughty and mischievous presence in our world, but with critical sharpness. And I think one of the things that our discipline has had is a lot of characters.
That's true.
In its time, And I wonder sometimes how you feel about it. Some of those characters were pretty difficult to handle or to be around, I have to say, but many of them very, very inspiring.
Yeah.
And I wondered what you think just about the modern university that's prone to so much pressure for us to professionalise, for us to meet targets, for our creativity to be captured within metrics and things like that. And so I just wondered wanted to ask you a little bit about that and whether we might be in danger of, in that situation where so much of what we do is being standardised, of losing some of that quality, that character, if you like.
Well, I've recently been in the States because one of my sons has adopted a baby. And I am very aware of the fact that sociologists are a lot more professionalised in the States than we are. And although we could talk about the figures who are characters, if you like, in the American situation, I think there are many who are rather safe and boring, neo-Parsonians or neo-Weberians. The exceptions, I would say, are people like Eric Olin Wright and Howard Becker, who have recently died, but also still alive. People like Marion Fourcade, who writes on economics, and Michael Burawoy, who was president of the American Sociological Association, and perhaps Ali Hochschild, Loic Lacan. So there are a few, but and maybe I'm being grossly unfair. If so, I apologise. In terms of British sociology, I think sociology has not been legitimate for so long. It was when I started, it was clearly an invader in the university and was seen as so dangerous they wouldn't allow sociology to be taught in Scottish schools. We tried very hard, but they wouldn't accept it. And I think there have been a lot of characters associated with British sociology. Herminio Martins, who tutored me, has been mentioned already, who wrote very interesting articles on time and also on Brazil, and then in his later life, very strange and weird and bizarre articles on the sociology of the body, reflecting on IVF and surrogacy and so on. And I think of the great social critics whom we have had. For example, even people as close to us as the Glasgow Media Group, social critics, like Alison's father, John Eldridge, and Greg Philo. And John Eldridge particularly had to speak truth to power in a way that the BBC and other television authorities did not like. And in fact, they tried to crush the publication of their results. So we have had people, John Rex would be another, who, along with C. Wright Mills in America, who, if you like, retained a kind of closet Marxism, who I think have resisted that mediocrity that sometimes goes with professionalism.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, it's always a joy to listen to you, and so we should thank you for that, and for so much of what you do as a point of inspiration, actually. Bears saying. So thank you for that, Bridget. And we'll have a chance to...
So, huge thanks to both of you. Les, thank you so much for asking the questions and engaging so thoughtfully. And Bridget, thank you for sharing these reflections and experiences. it's, as Les rightly says, always a joy to listen and to learn from you. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes, everybody. So if anyone would like to ask questions to Bridget and indeed all to Les together, over to the floor. Yes.
I'll do the right thing.
Where am I going? Oh.
If you could just introduce yourself, that would be. If you could just introduce yourself, that would be great, so we know.
Sure. Hi. Hi. I'm Ash Watson. Thank you so much for this amazing session. It was so lovely to hear more about the monograph. I look forward to reading it whenever they actually manage to get it out. Bridget, I wanted to hear a little bit about how it felt for you for your son to produce the film. What was it like for you, for him to, I suppose, turn his camera on you?
Thanks, Ash. Yeah. It was an unexpected experience, and I was glad he didn't put me in visually, just my voice. But I was very grateful to him, and I think actually in some ways it's much better because I'm not there as a person. You just concentrate on the tools of my trade. So yeah, I was pleased, and I really found it quite touching. Yeah.
Thanks, Ash. Any other questions? Yes. Sorry, one. Karen here, and then.
Yeah, I've got another one there too. Oh, do you want this one?
Bridget, I wondered what changes you'd seen in the cohort of sociology students in your time at the University of Glasgow over the period in which you were teaching, whether their background, their motivations, or how they see the world.
Thank you, Karen. That's a very good question. When I started at Glasgow University, there were 6 honours students, that's in the 3rd and 4th years, and 6 members of staff. And I think Les now has charge of 120 sociologists. So it's a very different environment. 120 staff, I should point out. The honours students particularly were very impressive students in Glasgow, although we've always had an enormous number of 1st and 2nd years. We've often had to put a cap on them because there were more than we could cope with, even giving double lectures. I think in the first period that I was there weren't so many women sociology students. Doing honours was something that was more for the male students. And the women, if they got degrees, were meant to go and be primary school teachers or social workers. And that has all changed. But I would make one other reflection, or 2 others. One, I think many more of them have to work much more now. So they can't read as much. And perhaps some of them have even lost that ambition of reading as much and expect us to more spoon-feed them and tell them what chapter of a book to read, which for me is a loss. The other thing I would say about Glasgow University is, as you will know, the west of Scotland is an area which has historically had a lot of industry, a very big working class. Edinburgh, on the other hand, has a much smaller working class. And I was once external examiner in Edinburgh University, and one of their members of staff said, "Oh, well, we only get about 35 in each of the honours years." And that was at a time when we were getting over 100. And he said, we wish we had more, but it's to do with the social origins of our students. Their students come from much more privileged social origins, and sociology is not seen as such a desirable subject to do. So there's been this interesting intermesh between Glasgow University and the nature of the industrial region we're situated in.
Thank you. I think there's another question down there.
Rose Mudeem. I'm just thinking about, if you think back on your career and what you've written, which of the things the many things that you've written do you think you're most proud of now? I mean, it may not have been so at the time, but can you say what it would be if you said now?
That's an interesting question. I quite liked The Alienated Reader book, but I was very conscious of not being trained in English literature, and so I was a bit inhibited about whether I was really doing justice to the popular literature I was reading, looking at women's magazines and popular fiction, particularly romantic fiction. The book that I probably feel is most original and also has been carried through empirically most solidly is The Obituary as Collective Memory. I also quite like my book on Bourdieu, which is Pierre Bourdieu and Cultural Theory. But of what I've written on Bourdieu, the article that I most like is the one I referred to in the questions, which is called Pierre Bourdieu and Social Transformation, and looks particularly at symbolic revolutions, and that's in Theory and Society. Is that enough?
Any other questions anyone would like to ask? Well, maybe I'll just abuse chair's privilege, Bridget. And I mean, you're someone who has never in any way shied away from being very clear about your political and normative commitments. You've been very politically outspoken in all kinds of ways. I just wondered if you had reflections about, or could just, talk a little bit about your experiences of trying to maintain those kinds of political commitments within the university setting, and what the challenges have been in doing that, and whether you've seen any changes in that respect in the institutions.
Well, thank you, Andy. I have seen changes in the institution, but yes, what I'd say was I've never agreed with Max Weber in his Science as a Vocation when he said that lecturers in sociology should never, ever come to any political conclusions or any political recommendations at the end of their lectures. He has ruled that out as what he calls being a prophet, which he thinks should not happen in the lecture room. And I really don't agree with him about that. As Ruth Levitas was saying this morning, I feel that if you analyse, if you say very fully what the is, then you're entitled to say what you think ought to be, with the proviso that you tell students you're now going to be political, and they may not agree with you, and they don't, logically, they are not forced to accept your conclusions. So that's been very important. Max Weber also called Rosa Luxemburg, whom I admire and don't know enough about, he called her someone who belonged only in the zoo. So he probably would think the same about me. I've recently been reading a book by Alec Nove, the Soviet economist, which came out a long time ago in 1983, called The Economics of Feasible Socialism. And he's, I'm glad to say, calls Rosa Luxemburg an intelligent Marxist. But he has very interesting ideas, which I think we need to bear in mind now, particularly in relation to the fact that he was an expert on the Soviet Union and its catastrophes, and the other East European countries. And he argues that you do need to socialize the main means of production, the utility, the health sector, education. But the rest of the economy, he thinks, should be run on small businesses or co-ops with workers' participation in industrial democracy. But he does think that in that section, the market is unavoidable and money is unavoidable. And I'm afraid at my great age, I have come to that conclusion that those who think that utopia is realizable without any market at all are probably under a misapprehension. And what I've tried to do is to have a kind of parallel life, as you know, where I'm involved with the Centre for Socialist Theory and Movements in Glasgow University, and we've had people from a number of disciplines up to talk to us about the nature of the contemporary world and how they was envisaged transforming it. Yeah.
Are there any final questions? In one sense, that feels like quite a nice place to end, because it finishes the day off where we started it, doesn't it? With a recognition that it is possible to have a sociology that is willing to talk about what ought to be, or what might be, or what could be. So perhaps that's a nice way to come to an end of at least this section of the day. There's still some final comments to come to close the conference up as a whole. But perhaps you could join me in just saying thanks again to Bridget and Les, and thank you all for your questions and attendance.